April 24, 1944. 26-year-old Wing Commander Leonard Cheshire sits in the cockpit of a de Havilland Mosquito, heading straight into hell. Below him, the city's searchlights snap on, one by one, then dozens, then hundreds. The beams converge on his aircraft like the fingers of some monstrous hand, squeezing, crushing, blinding him with pure white light. Every gun in range opens fire. Flak bursts pepper the darkness. Shell fragments tear through his fuselage. His instruments vanish in the glare. He can barely see, can barely control the aircraft. And then Leonard Cheshire does something that defies every instinct, every regulation, every principle of bomber warfare that's been written into RAF doctrine. He dives lower. 600 feet now. 500. The guns below him are firing almost horizontally. The searchlights are so bright he's losing control. His wingman is screaming at him over the radio to climb, to get out, to save himself. But Cheshire has 260 Lancaster bombers following him into this inferno, thousands of feet above, watching, waiting for his signal. 7-man crews who will live or die based on what he does in the next 30 seconds. He releases his target markers with surgical precision. Then he pulls up, barely. And for 12 agonizing minutes he stays over Munich, flying through concentrated anti-aircraft fire that should kill him 10 times over, directing the bombing raid, making sure his markers are visible, making sure the attack will work. What Cheshire is doing this night will change bomber warfare forever. It will cut RAF losses by more than 75%. But first, it might just kill him. To understand why Leonard Cheshire was willing to die over Munich, you need to understand what RAF Bomber Command was facing in 1943. The numbers were catastrophic. Out of 125,000 aircrew who served in Bomber Command during World War II, 55 of 573 were killed. That's a 44.4% death rate. Nearly 1 in 2 men who climbed into a bomber never came home. To put that in perspective, it's the highest death rate of any branch of the British military during the entire war. Higher than infantry. Higher than submarine crews. Almost as high as Japanese kamikaze pilots. And here's the truly devastating part. They weren't even hitting their targets. In August 1941, a civil servant named David Butt analyzed photographs taken during RAF bombing raids. His report, what became known as the Butt Report, concluded that only 1 in 3 aircraft claiming to have bombed their target actually got within 5 miles of it. 5 miles. In the heavily defended Ruhr Valley, it was 1 in 10. Think about that. Young men, 19, 20, 21 years old, were climbing into Lancaster bombers, flying 6 hours through night fighters and flak, and 2/3 of them were dropping their bombs on empty German countryside. The problem was simple to state. Impossible to solve. How do you hit a target you can't see? Night bombing was born from brutal necessity. The RAF had tried daylight bombing in 1939 and early 1940. The losses were unsustainable. German fighters ripped through the unescorted bomber formations. On one raid, half the attacking force was shot down, so they switched to night bombing. The darkness protected them from fighters, but it also made accurate bombing nearly impossible. Pilots navigated by dead reckoning, mathematical guesswork. They identified targets by comparing darkened cities to maps memorized during briefings. In bad weather or heavy cloud, they simply dropped their bombs where they thought the target might be. The result? British bombers were killing German civilians while missing German factories. By 1942, RAF Bomber Command formed the Pathfinder force, elite squadrons equipped with new electronic navigation aids like G and H2S radar. Their job was simple: find the target, mark it with flares and incendiary bombs, and let the main bomber force aim at the markers. It helped, but not enough. The problem was altitude. Pathfinder aircraft marked targets from 10,000 to 18,000 feet. At that height, even a small aiming error meant markers could land hundreds of yards from the actual target. Wind drift pushed the markers further off course. And in the chaos of a bombing raid, with fires spreading, smoke rising, and German decoy fires being lit, it was almost impossible to tell if you were bombing the right markers. The solution seemed obvious: mark from lower altitude. But that was suicide. German anti-aircraft defenses were among the most sophisticated in the world. Cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and the Ruhr Valley were protected by thousands of 88mm flak guns, radar-directed searchlights, and interlocking fields of fire designed to shred any aircraft that dared fly low. A Lancaster bomber, with its 7-man crew and 14,000-pound bomb load, flying at 200 miles per hour at low altitude, was a sitting duck, heavy, slow, unmaneuverable, which is why in September 1943, when 617 Squadron attempted a low-level attack on the Dortmund-Ems Canal, 5 of 8 aircraft were shot down. 5, including the squadron's new commanding officer. The RAF immediately abandoned low-level bombing for heavy aircraft. The directive was clear. Precision bombing would continue from high altitude only. But Wing Commander Leonard Cheshire saw something everyone else missed. He saw that the problem wasn't low-level bombing itself. It was the aircraft. Leonard Cheshire wasn't a natural pilot. Born in 1917, the son of an Oxford law professor, Cheshire was more comfortable with books than machinery. His early flight instructors gave him mediocre marks. Nothing special. No natural talent for flying. But what Cheshire had was something far more valuable than talent. He had a mind that refused to accept that things couldn't be improved. In November 1940, during his first operational tour, Cheshire's Whitley bomber was hit by flak over Cologne. A shell exploded inside the fuselage, blowing out one side of the aircraft and starting a fire. The aircraft was mortally damaged. Any reasonable pilot would have turned for home. Cheshire continued to the target, dropped his bombs, and brought the burning aircraft back to England. He was 23 years old. By March 1943, at age 25, he was the RAF's youngest group captain. But here's where Cheshire made a decision that defined everything that followed. He voluntarily gave up his rank from group captain to wing commander so he could take command of 617 Squadron. Think about that. He took a demotion, gave up status, pay, comfort. Why? Because 617 Squadron flew operations, and Cheshire believed that the only way to solve bomber warfare's problems was to fly the missions himself. When Squadron was already famous, 3 months earlier, under Wing Commander Guy Gibson, they'd conducted the legendary dams raid, Operation Chastise, breaching 2 massive German dams with Barnes-Wallis's bouncing bomb. But Gibson was gone, promoted and removed from operations, and 617 Squadron was struggling to find its purpose. Cheshire took command in November 1943, and immediately he started experimenting. The problem, as he saw it, was accuracy. The main bomber force couldn't hit what they couldn't see. High-altitude marking was too inaccurate. Low-altitude marking in heavy bombers was too dangerous. So what if you used a different aircraft? What if you marked targets with something small, fast, and maneuverable? On February 8, 1944, Cheshire got his chance to prove it. The target was the Nome-Edron aero engine factory at Limoges, France. The factory was producing engines for the German Luftwaffe, but it was deep in occupied France, surrounded by French civilians. A high-altitude raid would kill hundreds of innocent people. Cheshire proposed something radical. He would mark the target in a Lancaster bomber, flying at rooftop height. He would circle the factory until French workers saw him and evacuated. Then he'd drop his markers with pinpoint accuracy. The main force would bomb from high altitude, aiming at his markers. Air Marshal Ralph Cochrane thought it was insane. He approved it anyway. On the night of February 8th, Cheshire took his Lancaster down to 700 feet over Limoges. He buzzed the factory roof. French workers looked up, saw the British bomber, and ran. Cheshire circled back and dropped his markers directly on the factory roof. 12 Lancasters from 617 Squadron, bombing from high altitude, destroyed the factory completely. Not a single French civilian was killed. It was a revelation. Low-level marking worked, but Cheshire knew the Lancaster was still too vulnerable. He needed something faster, something that could survive in the most heavily defended airspace. He needed a Mosquito, the de Havilland. Mosquito was one of the most extraordinary aircraft of World War II, built primarily of wood, plywood, and balsa. It was faster than most fighters. It carried no defensive armament. Its defense was pure speed. It could outrun anything the Germans had. And it was small enough to mark targets with unprecedented precision. In March 1944, Cheshire began marking targets in a Mosquito. The results were immediate. And stunning. Target after target in occupied France fell to 617 Squadron's precision bombing. The Michelin tire factory, railway tunnels, V-weapon sites. Each time, Cheshire would dive to rooftop height, sometimes as low as 50 feet, drop his markers, and climb away before the Germans knew what hit them. But the real test was coming. Munich, April 24, 1944. Munich was one of the most heavily defended cities in Germany. Deep in Reich territory, protected by hundreds of searchlights and anti-aircraft guns, the kind of target where the mere approach would kill crews before they reached the city. It was exactly the target Cheshire wanted. He requested it specifically. This would be the ultimate test of low-level marking. The plan was experimental. Pathfinder aircraft would drop flares from high altitude, illuminating the target area. Cheshire in his Mosquito would dive through the defenses, mark the precise aiming point, and direct 260 Lancasters of 5 Group to bomb his markers. But there was a problem. The route to Munich took Cheshire's Mosquito directly over Augsburg, another heavily defended city. He'd be under fire for the entire approach. Then once over Munich, the Pathfinder flares would illuminate him from above. Every searchlight and gun would have a perfect view. The tactical analysis was simple. The mission would probably kill him. Cheshire filed his flight plan. The night of April 24th was clear. Bad weather for bombers, good weather for German defenses. As Cheshire approached Munich flying at 4,000 feet, the Pathfinder flares ignited above him. The city lit up like a stadium. And then, as predicted, every searchlight in Munich locked onto his Mosquito. He was trapped in what pilots called a cone of light, dozens of searchlights converging on a single aircraft. The glare was so bright he couldn't see his instruments. The world disappeared in white fire, and the guns opened up. Owner flak shells burst all around him. Light flak 20mm and 37mm cannons created walls of explosive tracer fire. The Mosquito shuddered as shell fragments punctured the fuselage. Cheshire dove, 700 feet, 600, 500. At that altitude, the flak guns were firing almost horizontally. A near miss would destroy him. A direct hit was inevitable. But at 700 feet, with the entire German defense network trying to kill him, Leonard Cheshire's hands were steady. His voice over the radio was calm, almost casual. He released his markers. They landed perfectly. Then came the hardest part. Cheshire had to stay over Munich to direct the bombing. He had to assess the accuracy of his markers. Had to call corrections to the Lancasters above. Had to ensure the raid would succeed. For 12 minutes, he flew over Munich. 12 minutes of continuous anti-aircraft fire. His Mosquito was hit repeatedly. Pieces of the aircraft were missing. The controls were responding sluggishly, but Cheshire stayed. He watched the Lancasters release their bombs. Watched the markers he'd placed get obliterated by explosions. Watched the factory complex he'd targeted disappear in fire. Only then did he turn for home. The German gunners weren't finished. As Cheshire headed west away from Munich, they tracked him. For another 12 minutes, 24 minutes total under sustained fire, they tried to kill him. Cheshire came through. His Mosquito was a wreck, but he was alive, and the Munich raid was a success. More importantly, Cheshire had proven that low-level marking worked even against the most heavily defended targets in Germany. The impact was immediate. An operational research section report, analyzing raids from July 1944 to January 1945, compared high-level and low-level marking techniques. The numbers were stunning. High-level marking, done by Lancasters at 11,000 to 18,000 feet, had an average aiming error of 888 yards. Low-level marking done by Mosquitoes at 600 to 2,000 feet had an average aiming error of 274 yards, 3 times more accurate. But the most important statistic wasn't accuracy, it was reliability. In clear conditions, both methods worked well. But when clouds obscured the target, which happened frequently over Europe, high-level marking became unreliable. Markers couldn't see the target. They dropped their flares blind using radar. Low-level marking remained reliable regardless of cloud cover. The Mosquitoes dove below the clouds, visually identified the target, and marked it with precision. There was one significant downside: master bomber loss rates. In high-level operations, the master bomber, the officer coordinating the raid from above, had a 2.44% loss rate per mission. In low-level operations, the master bomber loss rate was 9.80%, 4 times higher. Why? Because the master bomber had to orbit the target area throughout the entire raid, often at low altitude, directing and correcting the marking while the main force bombed. He was exposed longer than any other aircraft. It was extraordinarily dangerous. Cheshire did it on every mission. By July 1944, Wing Commander Leonard Cheshire had completed 102 operational missions, 4 complete tours of duty. He'd flown against Berlin, Hamburg, the Ruhr Valley, Munich. He'd pioneered low-level marking techniques that had transformed precision bombing. On September 8, 1944, King George VI awarded him the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest decoration for valor. The citation is worth reading in full. It concludes, Wing Commander Cheshire has now completed a total of 100 missions. In 4 years of fighting against the bitterest opposition, he has maintained a record of outstanding personal achievement and supreme contempt for danger. His cold and calculated acceptance of risks is exemplified by his conduct at Munich. What the citation doesn't say, what Cheshire never publicly emphasized, was the impact his techniques had on bomber losses. The transformation of RAF Bomber Command's effectiveness in 1944 wasn't due to a single innovation. It was radar navigation. It was better training. It was the Pathfinder force. It was improved bomb sights and master bomber techniques. But low-level marking pioneered by Leonard Cheshire was the crucial breakthrough. Here's why it mattered. When markers were placed accurately, the main bomber force could bomb from high altitude with confidence. They weren't guessing. They weren't dropping bombs on empty countryside. They were hitting their targets. Accurate marking meant shorter bombing runs. Crews spent less time exposed over the target. Less time meant fewer losses to flak and night fighters. And when civilians saw the precision, when French workers at Limoges weren't killed, when factories were destroyed without leveling entire neighborhoods, it changed the moral calculus of the bombing campaign. The low-level marking technique wasn't just more accurate. It saved lives. Allied lives. German civilian lives. By the spring of 1944, dedicated Pathfinder squadrons, particularly 627 Squadron, had adopted Cheshire's methods. Mosquitoes became the standard low-level marking aircraft. The technique spread from 5 group to other bomber command groups, and the results were undeniable. In early 1943, before precision marking techniques matured, bomber command aircraft were getting within 5 miles of their targets only 50% of the time. Losses per raid often exceeded 5%, unsustainable over any length of time. By late 1944, with low-level marking and master bomber techniques fully implemented, bombers were achieving targeting accuracy within 300 yards. Mission loss rates for raids using these techniques dropped to 1 to 2%. That's a 75% reduction in losses. Let me put that in human terms. A typical raid involved 300 aircraft, each with a 7-man crew. At a 5% loss rate, 15 aircraft, 105 men, would die on each mission. At a 1.25% loss rate, fewer than 4 aircraft, about 25 men, would die. 80 men per raid lived because of techniques Leonard Cheshire developed. 80 men who went home to their families, who had children, who lived full lives multiply. That across dozens of raids, thousands of lives saved. The low-level marking technique had one more crucial advantage. It allowed the RAF to bomb what they called targets in occupied territory, factories, railways, and military installations in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Before Cheshire's methods, these raids were impossible. The risk of killing Allied civilians was too high. The inaccuracy of high-altitude bombing meant French and Dutch citizens would die by the hundreds. But with low-level precision marking, Bomber Command could strike V-weapon launch sites in France without massacring French villages. They could destroy the Somme railway tunnel, cutting German reinforcement routes to Normandy before D-Day without killing civilians. These raids, conducted in the months before the Normandy invasion, directly contributed to the success of D-Day. German panzer divisions that should have reached the beaches in hours took days. Railway lines were cut, supply depots destroyed, Communication networks shattered, all because markers could be placed with 200-yard accuracy instead of mile-wide scatter. On June 6, 1944, when Allied troops stormed the Normandy beaches, they faced less resistance than expected. German reinforcements were delayed, confused, disorganized. Part of that, not all, but part, was Leonard Cheshire flying his Mosquito at 50 feet over French railway lines, placing markers that allowed heavy bombers to hit German infrastructure without hitting French homes. The final vindication of Cheshire's methods came in the autumn of 1944. 6 and 17, Squadron, now equipped with massive 12,000-pound tallboy bombs, began attacking hardened targets that had previously been invulnerable: U-boat pens with concrete roofs 20 feet thick, railway viaducts, and the German battleship Tirpitz. On November 12, 1944, 617 Squadron found Tirpitz moored in a Norwegian fjord. Using low-level Mosquito marking followed by precision high-altitude bombing with tallboy bombs, they landed 2 direct hits. The Tirpitz, one of the most powerful warships in the world, capsized. 1,200 German sailors died. But here's the crucial point. Without precision marking, that raid would have failed. The Tirpitz would have survived, and the Arctic convoys carrying supplies to Russia would have remained under threat. Low-level marking didn't just save bomber crews, it changed the strategic balance of the war. After 102 missions and 4 operational tours, Leonard Cheshire was grounded in July 1944. He was exhausted. What would later be diagnosed as severe post-traumatic stress was, in 1944, simply called exhaustion. Cheshire had pushed himself beyond what any human could sustain, but his techniques lived on. The Pathfinder squadrons continued using low-level Mosquito marking until the end of the war. 617 Squadron remained RAF Bomber Command's premier precision squadron, and the principles Cheshire established: visual low-level marking, master bomber control, offset marking techniques became standard doctrine. In August 1945, Cheshire witnessed the atomic bombing of Nagasaki as Britain's official observer. What he saw changed him. The man who had dropped thousands of tons of bombs on Germany, who had pioneered techniques that made bombing more effective, stood on Tinian Island and watched a mushroom cloud rise over Japan, and he understood that warfare had fundamentally changed. In his later writings, Cheshire reflected on what he'd learned over Munich. He said that he'd gone into that raid accepting that he would probably die, that the mission was more important than his life, but he also said something more profound. He said that the goal of war, even in its most terrible forms, should be to minimize suffering, to accomplish military objectives with the minimum loss of life. That's what low-level marking represented. It wasn't about being more deadly, it was about being more precise. After the war, Cheshire devoted his life to helping the disabled and disadvantaged. He founded what became Leonard Cheshire Disability, a charity that now operates in over 50 countries. He married Sue Ryder, another war hero who'd worked with Special Operations Executive. Together, they spent the rest of their lives serving others. Leonard Cheshire died in 1992, at age 74. The Catholic Church is currently considering his canonization as a saint, but his real legacy isn't sainthood. It's those 80 men per raid who came home. It's the French workers at Limoges who weren't killed. It's the principle that even in war, especially in war, precision matters. That doing something well can mean fewer people die. The technology Cheshire pioneered evolved. Low-level marking gave way to laser-guided bombs, GPS, and precision-guided munitions. Modern air forces can hit targets with meter-level accuracy from 30,000 feet, but the principle remains the same. Hit what you're aiming at. Minimize collateral damage. Accomplish the mission with the fewest possible casualties. That's Cheshire's legacy. Not the Victoria Cross, not the 102 missions, not even the Dams raid or the sinking of the Tirpitz. His legacy is the idea that even at 700 feet over Munich, with every gun in Germany trying to kill you, with your aircraft falling apart around you, you can choose precision over brutality. You can choose to do the hard thing, the dangerous thing, because it's the right thing. On the night of April 24, 1944, Leonard Cheshire proved that one person, with extraordinary courage and a willingness to risk everything, can change the rules. He showed that this is how we've always done it isn't good enough. He showed that the crazy idea, The one everyone says won't work might be exactly what's needed. And he showed that sometimes, the only way to save lives is to risk your own. 700 feet over Munich, every gun firing, searchlights blinding, one man in a Mosquito, refusing to die, refusing to fail. That's how you change history. That's how you save thousands of lives, one impossible mission at a time.